Hey everyone, I'm Karan Munalingal, Head of Sales Engineering here at Itential. Today we're going to discuss and demonstrate how our NetOps and CloudOps teams can bring about, operational consistency across their network. And as you know, because the network has exploded based on Chris's comments, right? It's traversing across multiple different domains, and every domain have their own set of technologies. So, whether you go from data center to SD-WAN to cloud platforms or into the distributed edge, right? So that's what we're going to talk about today. And, I think as network engineers, we can come to consensus the fact that we have managed networks for such a long time, but because the concept of network has now evolved over time and is beyond your data center, LAN, WAN, into the cloud platforms, as well as SD-WAN and NAS, like white box controllers coming into play, you start thinking about, hey, I still need to do my job. I still need to do compliance, remediation. I still need to do config management across all of these beyond what I'm doing today, right? So, an example there is all these concepts of, hey, I'm managing my interfaces or ACLs today in my data center, but now I have to do the same thing in the cloud, even though the concepts sound very similar, like, they could translate. The way that you actually change and manage is drastically different, right? Because we talked about right tool for the right job, but then the actual tool gives you a different way of managing those assets, infrastructure, and services. So, at Itential, we're very excited about all the innovation happening in the network. In addition to all the things happening at the device level where new features are coming in, now we start expanding into the new concepts of SD-WAN. Everything is going software defined, and we're going into the cloud computing, into the edge. So all these new vendors start coming and bringing their own technology stacks. So as a network engineer, as an operation engineer and a cloud architect, now I have the responsibility to manage my entire network, right? The network is not segmented. It's actually multi-domain. So, you have heard Chris talk about this, and the innovation brings complexity. And now the complexity, when you talk about having a consistent way of managing it, that becomes very critical, because if not, you're trying to swivel chair across the board and possibly handing off at places where there's a disconnect, right? That's a big thing that we hear about from our customer base. So, operational consistency is a big thing that enterprises, as well as all the NetOps and the CloudOps teams, are looking for. If I go to the next one, for the longest time, automation, and even now, like automation is now very important. That is the number one thing that CIOs, CTOs, everyone want to get to, right? Because that's what allows you to get that go-to-market, that speed of delivery on how you roll out your services and the offering. But the thing is, the network is not just bounded to your DCs anymore, right? Now that it has kind of gone beyond and you're offering services that are truly multi-domain, there are different tools and technologies and techniques now provided by these vendors across these domains. So you can think about how before you were able to leverage, things like the CLI techniques that Rich talked about in his demonstration, where you can make a change onto a network device, but now you have to do the same thing through a Meraki controller, right? Which is API driven. So what we see is there's a huge explosion of technologies out in the market that us network engineers and cloud architects have to use in order to kind of bring that together and provide these kind of automation over the top. So trust and confidence is the main thing here, right? Before we open up the doors to all and any sort of automation, it is now imperative, like it's imperative that you want to make sure that you provide that trust to your NetOps and CloudOps team before they start automating. Because if not, if you write the wrong automation, it can go already really fast, right? Just like a human would do it, it would go bad faster. So now people are thinking about, how do I do the concept around compliance and validation, not just for my CLI-driven devices, but also my API-enabled services. And that's what you're going to hear me talk about today and show as part of my demonstration, is how Itential is going to enable our teams within organizations to kind of tie that bridge and provide that confidence that is needed so we can accelerate on the automation goals. So that brings us to the Itential Configuration Manager application. Federation is key, right? Now your network is very distributed across so many domains. Technologies talk differently to each other. And our goal is to provide a federated and easy way for your NetOps and CloudOps teams to manage these assets and infrastructure, right, across the board, right? So we practice federation, which means it's real time, and we don't want to keep stale data, because if you're trying to do automation on top of stale data, you know things can go wrong. The second part of this is golden configuration. So that is another thing where we're allowing you to set some of the best practices, some of the gold standard, not only on the CLI driven assets, but also API enabled services and infrastructure, right? It is critical because now you have to live in both worlds. You also have tool sets to allow you to do the concept of compliance and validation across both. And the final step is, you could do it, or you could get a compliance report and ask somebody to fix things. We believe in automation, right? Automation first. And that's why you're going to see as part of the demonstration today on, in addition to how you define these policies, the way that you go and remediate also has to be an automated fashion in order to scale. So with that, I'm going to quickly go over the demo architecture. So as part of the demonstration today, what you're going to see me do is utilize our config manager application to define some policies and standards on CLI-driven devices, namely the CSR1KV, but at the same time, leverage our integration into things like EC2 and Meraki in order to drive the same concept there. So now you'll see both of the world kind of merge together as part of the application to kind of give you that operational consistency. All right, now is the demo time. So let me quickly switch the screens. All right, so this is our Itential automation platform. Might have seen this as part of Alex's demonstration. What we're gonna do is dive right into the configuration manager application, right? So what you see in front of you is our config manager app. On the left-hand side is the list of federated devices. So let me actually quickly go into that. You will notice these are either virtual appliances or hardware devices being federated across different sets of technologies in different domains, whether it's automation gateway underneath that's using Ansible, or it's a service orchestrator. At the same time, you also have VNets and VPCs being pulled from the cloud. So if I were to click on one of these devices, let's say Core ATL1, it actually tells me the status of the device, and I actually load live configuration on it. And as a network engineer, you'll quickly realize that, hey, that's just a native configuration that I see on devices every single day. Now, if you fast forward, and on the left-hand side, I can now perform the same action of loading live config on a cloud construct, right? Which is a VPC. It's a virtual private cloud that returns JSON object, right? So now you actually see the contrast. Hey, I'm dealing with network devices that return native config, whether it's Junos or Cisco or Arista. At the same time, I'm able to use the same application to pull JSON context via their APIs, right? So you can see how this would make our cloud ops and NetOps teams' life easier, where they only focus on the intent to say, hey, I just want to do a backup, or I just want to do a diff between these things. And they don't have to worry about which technology underneath is driving that change or that request, right? That's where the concept of federation comes into picture. And what's critical here is, as part of Alex's demonstration, he actually added 3 different VPCs. And because if I go back to this page, there's a refresh button here. If I were to click that, all 3 of those VPCs will be pulled in here. And I can actually see the configuration of those VPCs live, right? So because we live in a world where assets are immutable and they keep going back and forth, this is the best way to do it is through the federated way. So what I'm gonna do is quickly move on to the golden configuration application, where let's talk about how you define some of these golden configuration on CLI-driven assets, right? For the longest time, we've been using NCCM tools in order to drive some of these golden configuration policies. But from Itential's perspective, we're now taking a more robust and different approach where we're providing a tree-like structure on the left. And what that means is you have a single pane of glass to define what your network segment looks like. So in this case, on the left-hand side, I have a base node. And within the base node, I've defined these 3 lines, and these are my policies, right? It basically says any single device that comes on in my network, whether it's greenfield or brownfield, I want these 3 lines on that need to be on those devices. At the same time, what I can do is I can change the policy on the fly. So I can say, hey, look, I don't want this line anymore, right? So I actually want the AAA new model on every single device. So I can quickly change that to disallow, and I can change the severity of that to error. So at this point, what I'm dictating is going forward, any device that shows up in my network has to follow this gold standard policy. So let's say you have defined your base, and on the left-hand side, you'll notice it's a hierarchical, right? So now, let's say I have a new site in London, which is the east site. So when I go into that, this is all the configuration that is inherited top to bottom. So you'll notice there's color mapping. So this represents the base node and the Europe node, and finally the east node. So you'll notice how we're allowing our customers to now define some of these rule sets at each node level, right? So you'll notice in this case, I'm saying, hey, look, I want to disallow this. So if this shows up on any of the devices as part of my Europe node, please alert me so I can remediate that. At the same time, you have severities being set. So if these two access lists are not on any of the devices, please let me know. So those are error and those are critical. But you can also variabilize any of these configurations. So this is what represents a variable. And finally, as part of this release, because we want to be model driven, and there's a lot of customers and NetOps teams that also want to use concepts like Jinja. Now you can actually add Jinja to this canvas, right? So you can define your day 0, day 1, day n configuration in models, and then you can drive that using the variables here, right? So just imagine defining this gold standard and getting the values of these from a distributed source of truth. So as part of the automation that Alex discussed, you can now go to an IPAM system or ServiceNow to actually fetch these values and run compliance against all these devices in your network, right? So let's say I'm happy with my gold standard. I can go to the managed devices. Now I can add a new device here, right? So you'll notice how we federate it. In this case, I'll go ahead and add ATL 0, apply, and it has run compliant. So as a user, I can quickly understand how in compliant and network ready my devices are, right? Because that gives me confidence before I start automating on top of it. So, as a user, through using the GUI, you can start clicking around, you can add these and remediate them. At the same time, everything that I'm clicking on in the platform is available via an API or a drag and drop function within our automation studio. So you can literally define an automation to do this in an automated fashion. So that was my brief overview of how we do and how we allow our customers to do this in a robust fashion on CLI-driven assets. Let's now take a look on how we're going to do this on an API-driven. So I mentioned we're going to do this on our Meraki wireless network. So before I get to that, let me quickly just give you a backdrop, right? This is what our small little Meraki network looks like in the office, right? We have a bunch of access points. Each access points have a bunch of SSIDs. So what we're going to do today is define standards on our open PSK and private SSIDs, right? So if I go to the SSIDs page, these are all the SSIDs that are available that have been configured by our network admin. And what we're going to do is we're going to see how in compliant they are with the standard that I set as an admin, right? So organizationally or at any node level. So let's say you have branches. That branch is going to have an admin and they're going to have their own set of specific gold standards that they would set. So how do we actually do that in a more distributed fashion to make sure that nobody's opening up SSIDs, which now becomes a security nightmare, right? So what I'm going to do is quickly go back to the configuration manager application and let's look for the SSID golden config tree. So this is what it looks like, right? So what you notice here is I have kind of segmented my SSID list into 3 different sections. One is open, which, when visitors show up, that's what it's for. And if I click in the configuration tab, you will notice there's a difference here, right? I am not copying and pasting or importing device configuration. This is a JSON object. It represents a context which is API driven, right? The resulting data structure of an API is JSON. So now I'm actually saying all of my open SSIDs need to have these attributes and they need to be these values, right? Just statically, or you can variabilize these as well. Same thing across PSK. You'll notice for a PSK SSID, it looks a little bit different, right? I have different encryption node, different assignment ID, et cetera. So you can start thinking about how you can segment it and how you can define your own gold standard for these SSIDs. So let's do this. Let's go back to the open node. I'm going to go to the Manage tab. So similar to how I added a CLI-driven device into my previous golden configuration node, I'm going to do the same thing here for an API, right? But there's a difference. You'll notice some of these are already onboarded. What you'll also notice that SSID 6 is missing from here, right? So let's go ahead and add that as an afterthought to this list so I understand how in compliant is that specific SSID with my own standard. So when I click on this add task, you'll notice on the right-hand side, these are all the integrations that have been onboarded within the platform. This looks very similar to what Alex showed you as part of his demonstration from Automation Studio, right? Every single integration, every single API or action is now available at my fingertips to use to actually run compliance against. Because we're using Meraki in this case, what I'm going to do is just open this up. These are all the actions available that I can utilize in order to go pull information about that specific SSID. But there is actually a call, get network SSID. So I'm just filtering that through, and you'll notice it'll show up here. So what I'm going to do is click on this task, and on the left-hand side, it's going to ask me for details, right? Because we're federating and dynamically generating these actions, let's say an API is changed by Meraki tomorrow, that will now appear here, right? So what I'm going to do is quickly add and run, and I'm actually going to get my network ID very quickly. And let's add that here. And then number 5, and let's say, and submit. So what it's doing, it has actually executed that API live against our Meraki controller in order to fetch this information. Once I save it, now it has been added. So you can imagine, you don't have to manually do this. Everything I'm clicking on is also available as a drag and drop task within the Auto Studio or an API. So you can imagine anytime an SSID is onboarded in Meraki, you can automatically add that to this tree to make sure that it is in compliance, right? So we talk about how network is constantly changing, and that is our approach. So what I'm going to do, just like I did for the CLI, I'm going to run the compliance, and then we're going to take a look at the results here, and it is completely in compliance, right? So let's do this. As a network administrator, I'm going to go to the Meraki controller and manually change some of these SSIDs. So I'm going to change this to click through. I'm going to change the band selection to 5 gigahertz, save changes. I'm going to do the same thing for SSID 7. Let's change it to click through and dual band, right? So once I do this and go back to the configuration manager, I'm going to go ahead and run compliance on it. And we will see, because of that ad hoc change from the administrator, these two are now out of compliance, right? So if I click into it and say view compliance, you'll notice what exactly is out of compliance. So the last step here is I could manually bring this into compliance, give this report to the network admin and say, hey, go undo the changes somebody else did. And or I could just kick off an automation that does that for me, right? So because we are automation driven, we want to make sure that we provide these ways to drive these changes in the network that are completely distributed and a different set of technologies.
This configuration management component, is this part of your core product, or is this a separately licensed tool?
No, so it is part of our product, but I know Chris is listening, but from an offering perspective, it's just like a plugin. So it's an application that sits on top within the automation platform.
Gotcha.
Yep.
And do you have any customers that aren't ready to go all in on certain automation use cases that just kind of dip their feet in with the configuration management and validation, or more of them doing more automation through your platform?
Oh, no, absolutely. And it's a combination, right? So and someone asked this earlier as well, where do they start? So from a comfort level perspective, they always start at a domain level. So let's say, hey, I'm just trying to do some config management changes, and I want to be able to tie that into all my other integrations like ITSM system and ticketing. But then they're like, okay, well, let's think about it. I have a network, I have to upgrade. Folks are making changes on them. I also need compliance. So usually the compliance piece comes in once they kind of get used to our platform, but we also have customers that start off purely from a configuration management because that is their primary issue, right? Folks going in and bashing keyboards and modifying configuration, causing BGP lines to go down. So, depending on what the pain point is for the customer right now, and if they're trying to operationalize standards and make sure that nobody's pushing bad changes, that's where it starts, right? You have to define standards, and then you build automation on top of it. And that's why, as Chris mentioned, it's a combination of automation plus validation that gives you that real compliance you're looking for across the board.